verifying rough sleepers is something which is probably not as controversial as I think it should be, but it's something that came up at the end of our introduction to homelessness all training a few weeks back. Often we end up kind of just chewing the cud with people who kind of hang around after the training just to answer questions and talk about stuff that's interesting. And the question of verification came up, and specifically, can frontline workers do anything about verification in terms of challenging it? And I think the answer is yes, in terms of using housing law, using homelessness law, which I'll try and explain in a second. But just in order just to kind of clarify what it is I'm talking about, I'm not talking here about verifying rough sleepers for the purposes of the street count. I'm talking about this it's not new, but this kind of it's becoming more widespread where frontline services, so street outreach teams, day centres and so on, their first response to someone who is rough sleeping is not to actually put them up for the night or anything like that. It's to basically tell them, go back to where you've been rough sleeping. One of our team will come to verify that you are a real rough sleeper before we can offer you this support. And, in one sense, that means that people who are often very vulnerable already are told to go and put themselves in more harm, a chance of more harm before they will get helped. And if you go back to No Second Night Out, which is the thing at 10 years ago, it was built on the idea that rough sleeping is bad for people. So you don't want to allow people to rough sleep for a night more than they need to. So that's kind of what it is. So the question is, can you use homelessness law to challenge this type of practice? And the answer, I think, is yes in some situations. And as I say, to understand this, I guess it's just worth talking about Section 184 and 188 of the Housing Act, because basically, if you approach any officer in a housing authority and give the officer reason to believe you might be homeless and ask them for help with housing, you trigger Section 184 of the Housing Act, which basically means the council has to look into your situation immediately to see if there's any other duty owed to you. And if there's reason to believe you might be homeless, might be eligible, might be in priority needs, the council has a duty to provide you with temporary accommodation immediately. So there's a lot more. I've said a lot more in other videos about those two thresholds. They're very low, particularly Section 184 is incredibly low, to the point where judges have said it's basically impossible to say you're homeless and ask for help and not trigger Section 184. That's kind of the threshold is that low. And that basically, and so what that means is that if you were to approach a housing authority, a council for help with housing and say that you might be homeless, they cannot say to you, we don't believe you, go and rough sleep for a few nights and we'll come and find you. I mean, just to give you an idea kind of how ridiculous this gets, I was chatting to someone not too long ago who was a long-term rough sleeper, had been living somewhere, become homeless again, approached their local street outreach team for help, was told to go and rough sleep and someone would come and verify them within the next 48 hours. And lo and behold, no one turned up. So that was a bad start. If you want to kind of get any sort of therapeutic trust or any sort of like working relationship with people, telling them that they're a liar and then, basically failing to do what you said you're going to do is probably the worst thing you could do in terms of building trust with people who are already probably scarred by services before. So as I say, if you were to approach a housing officer in a council and say you're homeless and ask for help, they could not go through the verification process. They'd have to assume that you were telling the truth, that there was reason to believe you might be homeless, and therefore, they would potentially have to house you if you hit Section 188. A cynic would say that one of the legal ways councils can avoid these duties, and they are very onerous duties. So one of the legal ways to avoid these duties is essentially to surround yourself with voluntary sector organisations who are not under any of these duties. So if you go to a voluntary sector street outreach team worker and say, I'm homeless, can you help me out? They are not under any duty under the Housing Act to kind of actually help you. They can use their policy and say, okay, you've told us you're homeless. We need to check that you really are homeless, you really are rough sleeping. So go and rough sleep somewhere. We'll come and find you. And if we find you, then we'll accept you might be rough sleeping or whatever. So they can legally do that. Now, it's unethical to do that, I'd say, but they can do it legally. So as I say, a cynic would say that councils can surround themselves with well-meaning, nice voluntary sector workers as a way of protecting their own housing stock, if you look in real cynical terms. And what they'll kind of do is they'll pressurise these voluntary sector organisations to promote hostels, push people towards hostels rather than homeless applications and kind of settled accommodation that comes as a result of that. So in terms of, can you challenge this kind of practice? Well, the easiest way to do it, if you are working with someone who is telling you they're rough sleeping, is to bypass the street outreach team altogether and email the council and say, I'm homeless, can you help me? Because that triggers section 184 immediately. And you can do it on someone's behalf. So if they haven't got email or something, you can say, Joe Bloggs has given me consent to trigger a homeless application on their behalf. Give me consent to share data. Here's the email. Boom, you've done it. That you've just triggered section 184. And in that email, you said elsewhere, if you include details that give the council reasons to believe they might be homeless, which is them saying they're homeless, reason to believe they might be eligible, particularly British nationals claiming benefits is a good way, but there are other ways of doing it as well. And reason to believe they might be in priority need, so physical, mental health issues, all the rest of it. You have just given the council reason to believe they hit section 188. Therefore, they're under a duty to provide temporary accommodation immediately, and it bypasses all that that sort of voluntary sector stuff. Now, if you do that enough, so even if you're in the street outreach team, if I was in the street outreach team, I would very much do that. I don't care what the policy would say. I've got an ethical responsibility to safeguard my client group from harm. I would therefore, say, okay, great, we'll follow our policies, but I'm also going to send this email off to the council right now. If enough people do that, you're likely to push this problem back up the chain, up to the managers who make these policies. And I would say, you can legitimately just argue for the fact that these are not humane, fair ethical policies at all. And the number of managers I've heard kind of whinge on about, these rough sleepers, they're so difficult to engage. They don't want to engage and they choose to be homeless. And it's like, you idiots. The very first contact you had with them, or your service had with them, was to basically say that they're liars and that they needed to go and rough sleep in order for them to be helped. That is a very bad start. So that's kind of why we have this group of people, I think, who avoid services because they don't want to be treated like that. It actually stings to be told that, for no good reason at all, that you're a liar. That's not something that services should be doing. So that's kind of, I guess that's a way that I think things could be challenged. And I think just to kind of labour the point, I think this is part of what could be described as a hostile environment. It's a term I used. I read recently in the book Clustered Injustice, which is an amazing book. I'll talk about it elsewhere, probably by Professor Luke Clements. But he's kind of talking about this this institutionalised distrust of people who we're supposed to be helping. Is he uses that term hostile environment to kind of describe that. So where essentially people coming to services, the default position is that they must be lying, that they must be trying it on, that they must be, there must be more something to it. They don't really need the help. They're actually, choosing to be homeless or whatever. And that has a very, very serious harmful effect on individuals and the wider group of people that you're supposed to be helping, because they become very cynical of services, and rightly so. That should not be happening in 2021 to people who are on hard times. They should be treated with dignity and they should be believed, unless there is a very good reason to doubt them. So if they've just come out of their 9-bedroom mansion or something and it's theirs and everything, then okay, you've got a right to kind of question it. But for everyone else, which is everyone else, they can't be doing it. So as I say, if you're in that sort of role and you're not comfortable with doing this kind of verification process, you can challenge it. That's kind of you have the capacity to do it. And I think it is worth doing. It is worth sticking up for people who are, as I say, going to be left homeless and kind of left in a worse state than they were when they started the service.